What will Final Fantasy VII Remake Part 3 be like? Will it have Sephiroth summon the meteor? Will you be able to fly around the world map in the Highwind? And most importantly, will it include the snowboarding minigame? Well, in this video, I'm going to take a look at the second and third disc of the original game and use what we've learned from FF7 Remake and Rebirth to try and predict what we can expect from Remake Part 3. And yes, I will be going into full spoilers for all three of these games. This video will cover the start of Disc 2 to the end of the original Final Fantasy VII. If you want a detailed comparison of Disc 1 against Remake and Rebirth, then please check out these videos. And some of you may be saying, how can you use the original game to predict Remake Part 3 when it's already been established that this is a brand new continuity? And while that is technically true, we have to go off the patterns established by the first two remakes. Yes, both of these games have thrown big narrative curveballs at us, but they tend to keep them until the very end of the game. Most of Remake and Rebirth up until the third act is very similar to the original. They are often expanded or stretched, but they do make sure to hit all the major beats to please the old fans. And I think Part 3 will continue with this approach. So let's start at the beginning of Disc 2, which picks up right after the tragic death of Aerith. Cloud and the party continue to pursue Sephiroth up north. They go through the City of the Ancients and then climb up the caves which lead to the main section of the northern continent, where they cross the snowy plains and reach the Icicle Inn, a sleepy little ski village where Cloud gets the snowboard and does the minigame filled with balloons, igloos, and pine trees which you will inevitably hit. The Icicle Inn is also home to some old recordings that give backstory to Aerith, her parents, and the origin of Jenova. Now, unlike the original, FF7 Rebirth ends with the tiny Bronco fixed and ready to fly, but Cloud does tell everyone that Sephiroth is hiding up north. So I expect that Remake Part 3 will start with the party navigating through the snowy northern continent, which will act as both a tutorial and a reintroduction to the gameplay and combat, kind of like Nibelheim did for Rebirth. Carrying on with the tradition of expanding original locations, I expect for the Icicle Inn to be built out into an entire ski resort, and the snowboarding minigame to be expanded to the point where you can customize your board and outfit. I could also see the Aerith backstory sections incorporated into the remake as a full-on cinematic instead of CCTV footage. Maybe the game will even open up with a flashback of Aerith's parents before switching to the party in the present day. In the original game, the snowboarding section is followed by the party crossing this big glacier maze, then scaling this cliff face and navigating the ice caves before finally reaching the northern crater. All of these sections have very little dialogue, instead focusing on dungeon navigation and combat. And that works fine for the original, because at that point we're about 2/3 of the way through the game and the party are coming off the most emotionally charged moment in the entire story. So a big stretch of dungeon grinding works well to let it all sink in. But I'm not sure that would work for the remake. If Part 3 is anything like its two predecessors, then each of these areas could be expanded into a full-on dungeon which takes up an entire chapter, like the Mithril Mine or Mount Nebel. And having 3 back-to-back dungeons this early in the game would be terrible for the pacing. Therefore, I think the developers will most likely condense all these sections into a single area. Perhaps the party will find a way to go from Icicle Inn straight to the northern crater. After all, they do have the flying tiny Bronco. In the original, the northern crater is the setting for several pivotal story events. The party discover the real Sephiroth's body inside a Materia cocoon. After a few back and forths and some mind trickery, Sephiroth manipulates Cloud into giving him the black materia, which he then uses to summon Meteor. This in turn awakens the weapons, who are giant monsters created by the planet to protect itself. This calamity causes Sephiroth's big cocoon and Cloud to fall into the livestream. Meanwhile, Barret and Tifa are caught by Shinra. Now, the remake continuity has added a whole bunch of complexity to this section of the story. We've got a bunch of different white materia, plus Cloud incorporates the black materia into the Buster Sword, so expect this section to be a lot less straightforward in the remake. However, I still think that Sephiroth will end up summoning Meteor in one way or another. As I mentioned earlier, the remakes have shaken things up a bit, but they've tended to keep the core of the story pretty faithful to the original, and Sephiroth summoning the Meteor is one of the most important events in the entire game. It's the main threat that drives the entire second half of the story. After all, what's a bigger motivation for the protagonist than stopping a giant asteroid from ending the world. So I think we'll have Sephiroth summoning the meteor and awakening the weapons, but the way we get there will probably be different. And speaking of weapons, in the remake continuity, several of them have already been awoken much earlier in the story. However, these seem to be new weapons created for Rebirth. They actually look a lot more like Sin from Final Fantasy X than a weapon, so I'm pretty confident that the 5 original weapons will still play a big part in the remake. Now, after the events in the crater, the point of view switches to Tifa and Barret, who have been captured by Shinra and held at Junon. Rufus has decided to use them as scapegoats and publicly execute the pair on live television to take people's attention away from the giant meteor heading their way and the 5 kaiju attacking their cities. Oh, and also Sephiroth has created a big barrier around the northern crater that nobody can get to anymore. I think Remake Part 3 will turn the execution into a much bigger spectacle, just like it expanded on the parade in Rebirth. In the original, Sapphire Weapon attacks the city. Meanwhile, Barret and the rest of the party make their way through Junon and try to hijack the Highwind airship. And as you can see, the city's pretty barren during this section, something that I think Remake will definitely expand on. Expect to see huge crowds of people running away from Sapphire Weapon like something out of a Godzilla movie. Now, in the original, Sapphire Weapon's attack allows for Tifa to escape. She runs along the cannon, then gets into a quick slapping minigame with Scarlet before escaping on the Highwind. And I for one can't wait for a reworked, hyper-stylized slapping minigame in the style of the parade minigame. Now, the Highwind represents a staple of classic Final Fantasy games, the ability to fly around the world map in an airship. It was also an iconic part of the original game as you traverse the map with the giant meteor looming overhead, which means that the remake is going to have to include it in some capacity. Now, FF7 Rebirth got away with flying around certain sections of the world map in the Bronco, but it was on rails. And the sequel may end up doing the same thing with the Highwind, but I really hope they put in the work and allow for truly open world exploration. And this leads us to a larger question about the structure of the game's open world, because this section of the story does introduce a few new locations, but many of the key story elements do have characters revisit old locations like Junon and Midgar, but this time you're accessing new areas. And considering the way modern games are built and structured, it's a very real possibility that we'll be able to revisit locations from the first 2 games, but a large portion of them will be inaccessible. I'm sure they could use the meteor as a reason for why many of the locations are on lockdown. You know, the same way they had patrols looking for the party in Rebirth, making Midgar inaccessible. Okay, back to the original. The party reunite on the Highwind and are now free to explore the world and find Cloud. So where is he? Well, this was another one of those vague bits where the game didn't really give you many clues on what to do next. You see, Cloud just so happens to have been washed up on the beaches of Midgar, a little tropical village all the way on the south side of the map. And unfortunately, his brain is scrambled from falling into the live stream and the Mako poisoning. Tifa decides to stay with Cloud while Barret and the rest of the party set off to stop Shinra from obtaining the huge materia, which Rufus wants to strap to a rocket and then shoot at the meteor. The huge materia is split into 4 pieces located all around the world map. The first piece is at Corral Reactor, where the party have to find Shinra and then do this train sequence minigame. The second piece is at Fort Condor, where the party have to do this RTS minigame and then crack the big Phoenix egg. The third is underwater and requires the party to play the submarine battle minigame. And the final piece is at Rocket Town. Now, when it comes to the remake, I think this section will definitely be condensed and reworked. As I mentioned before, I don't think they're going to be including entire areas from the old game just for a cameo. There may only be one piece of huge materia already at Rocket Town, and this will also allow Remake Part 3 to hit 2 birds with 1 stone by adding in Cid's backstory, which they skipped over in Rebirth. I also have a bad feeling that the entire underwater section will be scrapped and relegated to a throwback minigame like the Fort Condor one in Rebirth. I just think that including both the Highwind open world mechanics and an entire underwater part of the world map is going to be too much for Square. But I really hope I'm wrong in this case, because I'd love to be able to harass Emerald Weapon underwater again. Now, midway through the huge materia hunt, the party returned to Midgar to check on Cloud, and by sheer coincidence, Ultimate Weapon just so happens to attack, which results in the village collapsing and Cloud and Tifa falling into the live stream. And look, the remake better include Cloud's derpy expression as he falls in. Now, this is where things get really lucid. Tifa travels inside Cloud's subconsciousness, where she learns about his feelings for her and the truth about the events at Nibelheim. Turns out Cloud never made it to soldier rank. Instead, he was a grunt infantryman who accompanied Sephiroth and Zack on their mission. Embarrassed, Cloud disguised himself with his helmet to avoid being recognized. This means that everything Cloud did in the original flashback was actually done by Zack. Now, after Zack confronted and lost against Sephiroth at the reactor, Cloud somehow managed to throw Sephiroth into the livestream but shortly fell unconscious due to his wounds. Professor Hojo then arrived. He took both Cloud and Zack and shoved them into these vats for about 5 years, hoping to turn them into Sephiroth clones. However, Zack would end up breaking free and escape with a very sleepy Cloud. The two men make it to the outskirts of Midgar, where they're apprehended by the Shinra soldiers who sadly gunned down Zack. But Cloud did survive, and he took the Buster Sword and framed a new identity around Zack as a way to cope with his trauma. But experiencing this heavy dose of backstory in the present day allows for Cloud to overcome his demons and embrace his true identity. And the rest of the party are all for it, and so Cloud gets back to leading them in the fight against Sephiroth. Now, on one hand, I'd think the remake would do a faithful adaptation of this section. Not only is it one of the most important parts of the overall story, but it's also been set up and heavily foreshadowed in Rebirth when Tifa is swallowed by the weapon. However, in the original, this section was so impactful because of the reveal that Cloud took Zack's place. It was the I am your father moment of the game. But at this point, everyone's known about Zack for about 3 decades. There's been an entire prequel game which was also remade. That and Cloud fought alongside Zack at the end of Rebirth. So in some ways, including this section beat by beat will kind of feel like retreading old ground. And I have a feeling that this is where they will include the Zack who's still alive in the alternate reality. Maybe he will be the one who helps Cloud to reconcile with his past. Because let's be honest, the way they left him at the end of Rebirth, he's not really doing much. I can also see Tifa having to battle Sephiroth, who's living rent-free in Cloud's head. Okay, back to the hunt for the huge materia, and as mentioned before, the final piece is at Rocket Town, strapped to Cid's old rocket that Shinra plans to launch at the meteor. This section involves the party fighting their way inside the rocket and then take off into space. And this is where Cid's arc comes full circle. He's finally got to go into space after dreaming about it all his life. Cloud removes the huge materia and the party bail in an escape pod, letting the rocket crash into the meteor, damaging it but not destroying it entirely. I never understood why the party was so against Shinra doing this. Like, it wasn't going to harm anyone on Earth. I think this is one of the sections they'll have to explain a bit better in the remake. And actually, the more I think about it, the more it seems like this entire huge materia rocket section may just end up being scrapped entirely, and instead the remake will focus on something like the war against Wutai, which we'll get to a bit later. The party hide the huge materia at Cosmo Canyon, and then they go back to the City of the Ancients, where they learn that, before her death, Aerith had summoned Holy, a powerful piece of white magic from the planet itself which would counter Meteor. Unfortunately, Sephiroth is blocking it, which is yet another reason why they've got to take him out. Now, in the remake, Aerith is still dead, I think, but she's able to communicate with Cloud a lot better than she did in the original. It seems to be a Force Ghost kind of dynamic, so I think Remake will streamline this entire section. Instead of having to go get the key underwater and then activating it at the City of the Ancients, I think Aerith will just tell Cloud that she summoned Holy. At this point in the original, Diamond Weapon suddenly jumps out of the ocean and heads straight for Midgar. Slowly. And it's up to Cloud and his friends to defeat it. And I like how if you don't intercept it, it will just stop outside the city and chill for a while. Cloud and the party take on Diamond Weapon and kick its ass so bad that it runs away. At the same time, Rufus, who has mounted the Sister Ray cannon on top of Midgar, fires it in an attempt to penetrate the big bubble surrounding Sephiroth at the northern crater. Not only does the beam destroy the barrier, but it also special beam cannons its way through the Diamond Weapon, which just so happens to be in the way. Unfortunately for Rufus, Diamond Weapon does shoot a few blasts at Midgar before it dies, damaging the city and seemingly taking him out. Now, this is another iconic part of the original game, so I'm pretty sure that Remake will implement it in some capacity. The obvious question is, how will Midgar be realized in the open world, especially juxtaposed against Diamond Weapon? I could see this entire sequence being presented as a cinematic with a battle against Diamond Weapon in between. Now, in the original, original, Cloud and the party decide to parachute inside Midgar to stop the remaining Shinra executives from destroying the city. And I think the remake will take full advantage of this to avoid building up more of Midgar than they need to. So the only way you'll be able to access Midgar in Part 3 would be via parachute, similar to the only way you were able to access Junon in Rebirth was via the Dolphin minigame. Cloud and his friends then navigate the undersection, which I guarantee will be turned into an entire dungeon in the remake, and then end by taking on this big mech piloted by Scarlet and Heidegger. Cloud and his friends then climb up the cannon and confront Hojo, who reveals that he is Sephiroth's father. Hojo then injects Genova cells into his own body and turns into this big ugly thing that you have to fight. With Shinra finished and the northern crater barrier destroyed, the party are finally ready to face Sephiroth. Each party member decides to take some time off before the final battle. For Cloud and Tifa, this means spending a romantic night together on a rock with the wind blowing and there being no blankets or anything. I'm sure this part and the entire Cloud and Tifa romance will be expanded quite a lot in Remake Part 3, seeing as they've already built on it quite a lot in Rebirth. The next morning, the party reunite, pop the jet boosters off the Highwind, and set off for the Northern Cave for the final confrontation with Sephiroth. The cave is the biggest dungeon in the original, which has the party split up and slowly descend down into the livestream. So you can be sure as hell this is going to be the longest dungeon ever in the remake. The final battle takes place in several sequences. First, the party split into three and fight Genova. Then they fight this big daddy Sephiroth with a little Sephiroth on top, and then take on the one-winged angel version of Sephiroth, who has the most over-the-top move in the entire game. It's called Supernova, and it literally destroys the entire solar system one planet at a time. This is followed by one final showdown between Cloud and topless Sephiroth. And this really isn't a battle, it's more of an excuse to show off Cloud's Omni-Slash and show that he has finally broken free of Sephiroth's control. With Sephiroth defeated, the planet is finally able to unleash a big Kamehameha, holy, against the meteor. Unfortunately, it's too late and Meteor's impact is inevitable. But at the very last moment, Arif's spirit reaches out from the great beyond and calls for the planet livestream to push the meteor back and destroy it, saving the planet. Apart from Midgar, which is wrecked. Now this is where I expect Remake to take things in a different direction. And the ending of the first two remakes have been so different and, let's be honest, convoluted that it's hard to predict what's gonna happen. And to be honest, I'm not sure if the developers themselves even know the ending, at least not at the time of Rebirth's release. But going off what's been established, I think the multiverse, alternate timeline trope will play a big part in the ending, for better or worse. I wouldn't be surprised if the developers took what we saw at the end of Rebirth and turned it up to 11, where we see Cloud, Zax, and other party members from countless realities fight a big omnipresent Sephiroth, aided by the coalition of interdimensional Ariths. They will have to introduce something new from a battle standpoint, because Rebirth has already used the Big Daddy Sephiroth, so it will probably be a multi-dimensional permutation of the one-winged angel. As for the ending, we will probably see glimpses of alternate realities like the ones where Cloud turns to the dark side, or where Sephiroth succeeds, or where Arith survives. But I think the main timeline, the one we've been following throughout the three games, will end in a similar way to the original. Don't get me wrong, there will definitely be some changes and some narrative curveballs, but I just don't think the developers are going to want to end this decade-long remake story with Sephiroth destroying the multiverses or Meteor crashing into the planet. So that's it for the main campaign, but the original game also had a bunch of different side quests, and I think a few of them will get incorporated into the remake. First is Vincent. He may be a hidden character, but the former Turk has become a fan favorite. Unfortunately, his presence in Rebirth was downgraded to a non-playable extended cameo. In the original, Vincent became a playable party member as soon as he joined the crew in the Shinra Manor. In addition to that, there was also a short little side quest in the Crystal Cave where Vincent has a bittersweet reunion with Lucretia. Plus, there was also an entire spin-off game which flashed out Vincent's backstory. Now, I think Remake Part 3 will most certainly make him a playable character and explore his backstory. There is also the Wutai continent on the west of the map. The original version of Wutai is home to this weird little side quest where Yuffie steals the party's materia, then gets kidnapped by the biggest pervert in the game, Don Corneo, and then the party have to work with the Turks to rescue her and Yelena. There is also a battle tower which culminates in a battle against Yuffie's father. Both these sections have some drama between Yuffie and her father, who turned Wutai into a tourist resort after losing the war against Shinra. Now, FF7 Rebirth has already set up a major conflict between Shinra and Wutai, so it's pretty much a given that it will play a substantial part in the third game, possibly replacing some of the story elements from the original like the huge Materia hunt, or alternatively it can be turned into a DLC like the Integrate DLC between Remake and Rebirth. And so that's it for my take on Final Fantasy VII Remake Part 3. One thing I know for certain is that Square Enix have a lot of ground to cover in this final installment, from all the new locations to the open world to the iconic set pieces and story beats, plus whatever new story changes they're planning to incorporate into this new continuity. So, do you think they'll be able to pull it off? Please leave a comment below with your thoughts and expectations for Remake Part 3. Which part are you most looking forward to seeing, and which elements from the original do you think will be changed? As always, thanks for watching. Please consider supporting me on Patreon, and a big thanks to all my existing patrons. Also, if you've enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, and hit the bell. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.